Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 9th week of 2015. For almost 25 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good people at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are David Green and David Johnson. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky has said in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. This and previous editions of this program are archived on YouTube and posted to the Facebook page for News from Neptune, where you'll also find comments from viewers, articles that we've referred to, and further comments from us. I also can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com, and I'm happy to receive your comments. Tonight, in the cold and snow at the end of February, we'll talk about things that are being so badly misreported in the media. This is a Where Are the Snows of Yesteryear edition for all that has been forgotten. For example, Obama's ongoing drone war, the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, as Chomsky says, that has killed thousands. Obama's request for a new declaration of war, for killing he's already doing in Iraq and Syria on the excuse of ISIS. Obama's all but secret proxy war in Ukraine, in which he intends nothing less than destruction of the Russian economy and regime change. Obama's sponsorship of a new coup in Venezuela, and JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, death squads operating in 130 countries, kidnapping, torturing, and murdering around the world. In each of these areas, the U.S. executive has killed thousands of people, contrary to both national and international law, and continues to do so. And he's arranging for the crowning achievement of his presidency to the establishment of control of both European and Pacific economies for the American 1% by means of trade pacts. And all American liberals seem to be able to do is suggest that our legislatures put their fingers in their ears and chant, "I can't hear you," when the mad Prime Minister of Israel speaks to Congress, for fear of disturbing the clientage relationship that supports U.S. imperialism in the oil-producing world. As Chomsky says, the general population doesn't know what's happening, and it doesn't even know that it doesn't know. But that's no accident. Obama's real talent is his ability to misdirect the attention of the American people. He lies more effectively than his immediate predecessors, and of course he has the immense help of the big business-run media. An important corrective to this is an article by John Pilger on the Counterpunch website today, "The Reckless Lies of Warmongers." Pilger concludes, "The responsibility of the rest of us is clear. It's to identify and expose the reckless lies of warmongers and never to collude with them." American liberals, to my great dismay, seem to me to be colluding with them to a remarkable degree. You're watching News from Neptune, where our format is to take turns suggesting stories that have been ignored or misreported, sometimes, if not often, even innocently, in the corporate media, and then asking our colleagues to comment on them. And David Johnson has the first story.
Okay, I'd like to talk about recent developments in Greece with the recently elected Syriza party. And, well, unfortunately, the campaign promise of Syriza was not hope and change, but hope is coming. Sound familiar? And unfortunately, the same results has happened. But unlike President, then-elect candidate Barack Obama's hope and change message, which he knew were all lies from the very beginning, in Greece it's a little different. The problem is that Syriza was elected on a platform by a majority of the Greek people to basically end the horrible poverty conditions of austerity that was imposed on them by the International Monetary Fund and the European banks. And they got elected on that, and then they started shortly after the election. They went to negotiate with the European Union bankers, the International Monetary Fund, and they really thought that they were going to be able to cut a deal with the European Union bankers. What they were basically proposing is, look, we can't repay you if Greece, doesn't have people having jobs and earning incomes and paying taxes. And they proposed basically a Keynesian style recovery. That basically one of the proposals was that they would issue euro bonds that would be sold to the financial interests and the general public, and that these would be used to basically pump money into the Greek economy, as well as the economies of Spain, Portugal, and Ireland that are also in a similar situation as Greece. To basically stimulate the economy forward, and also partial debt forgiveness. This has happened before, as far as where debts of certain countries have been forgiven, particularly Germany right after the Second World War. This was done. But much to their surprise, which of course a lot of people weren't so surprised. I think Syriza's biggest flaw at this point was that they didn't know who they were dealing with. The thing is that the neoliberal capitalist economies right now, basically I should say the corporate control 1% who's controlling policy in Europe and the United States, they don't want any kind of stimulus for the economy as far as giving people decent paying jobs and health care and basically any other kinds of investments in human infrastructure. They discarded that whole economic principle, if you will, decades ago. And they're all about basically enriching the corporate sector and the 1% at the detriment of working people. They want to push wage rates down to the absolute bare bones minimum, to the level of subsistence, to squeeze every little drop out of working people for the profits of corporations. They also want to raise taxes on working people to basically pay for and give tax benefits to corporations, the 1%, to even make even more money. So it looks like this Syriza agreed to a deal in order to get a 4-month extension that basically is the same deal that the previous government agreed to. And it seems like there's actually a rebellion going on right now in the Syriza party after this was made public, including one Syriza parliament member who's a 92-year-old ex-left-wing Nazi resistance fighter who basically made a public statement that I can't believe I've become part of this, so that I unintentionally but nevertheless gave false hope to people by being part of this coalition of Syriza. So big mistake, and of course, I said several years ago that I think the only solution to this whole crisis is Greece is going to have to leave the euro. And of course, I was, made fun of and attacked, saying, "Oh, they can't do that; it's impossible." But frankly, there's no other way for Greece to recover. Not to say that it's not going to be a painful transition, sort of like kicking a heroin habit or an alcohol habit, but nevertheless, it's something that I think it needs to be done for the long term. Otherwise, there's not going to be any kind of relief as far as a stimulus or any kind of bonds issued, because the people in control in Europe and the United States, the neoliberals, basically the financial sector, don't want this at all. It's basically goes against their whole their whole ideology of their privatization fetish, if you will. So that's kind of what my recent observations on Syriza are, and it's a real disappointing, frankly. And I hope it doesn't discourage voters in Spain to support Podemos, but unfortunately, they're going to encounter the same thing, I'm afraid.
Thank you, David. A take on the Greek situation, David?
Yeah, I guess I have a less pessimistic or less critical view on it, just from the reading I've been doing on websites like Counterpunch and watching the Real News and listening to interviews with people like Dean Baker and James Galbraith, and even in listening to what Yanis Varoufakis, the Greek finance minister, is saying. But it's still very much up in the air as to what this four-month period will mean, and whether there really is an exit plan, whether it's part of a strategy which might bring an exit from the euro, bring what's being called Grexit from the euro, without in a way that if it were done too suddenly, as you say, David, you can't just change a currency under these circumstances without going through lots of pain. And the analogy would be what Argentina did, I guess, in 2000 and 2001, where they disassociated their currency from the dollar and renounced their debts, and they had about a difficult period of maybe 3 months, and then were able to come back quite well over the next couple of years. So I guess I think it's still too, I may be being falsely optimistic in this regard, but I don't see it in quite as negative. I just see this as a process that I have a certain amount of faith in the Syriza leaders not to betray the principles upon which they were elected.
I think I'm somewhere between the two of you on this in a way. The question of the parallel with Argentina, I gather, has been questioned with regard to two issues particularly. One is that Argentina was not in a common currency as Greece is. What they had was a currency that was pegged to the dollar,
right,
and all they had to do was unpeg it, and they still had control of their currency and so forth, which the Greeks don't. And the attempt to reinstitute a Greek currency, the drachma, is fraught with difficulties. Even more importantly, I gather, in the case of Argentina, Argentina was able to reboot its economy because there was a great export demand, a great demand from abroad for products that it could export, primarily agricultural. That was the case then. That's not the case now, and certainly not the case for Greece. So on those two matters, Greece is nowhere near the position that Argentina was when it essentially defaulted. And that's what a Grexit really is. The Greeks default on paying their debts in the euro currency. How about the suggestion that I've heard offered by some that it's in fact the desire of the EU, of the European Union, to force the Greeks out, to make a horrible example of them, the idea being that if they force the Greeks out, the Greek economy collapses, as many people suggest it would even more than it has. It's collapsed quite remarkably in the last year or two. But a real serious crash of the Greek economy would be a horrible example to any other countries that might be tempted to disobey the rules from Action Central in Europe. And that this is directed to the Spaniards, to Podemos, to the Italians, the Greeks, the Irish, any other groups who want to make some sort of stand against the austerity rules. They should know that their situation would be worse. So I don't know. I mean, one more question about that. What about the suggestion of what has been called a Plan B? A Plan B for Greece being in some sense finding support from abroad, mainly from the Eurasian economy, from Russia and China, for an ability to fight out the question of debt repayments with the EU and insist on a better deal that would be backed in some sense by borrowing from elsewhere. I gather that's been suggested, and it's an interesting example this week. The Russians executed another large loan to Cyprus, and the Cyprus economy, which of course is separate from the Greek economy, although also within the EU, made an arrangement that some took as a model for what the Greeks might do. So.
Yeah, David, I hope you're right, and Carl, I absolutely agree about that. I thought the same thing, that Greece would need to look elsewhere, whether it be Russia, China, even Iran, or the Latin American countries like, of course, Venezuela's in hard times right now,
Right.
but Brazil.
Wonder why.
Yeah, because of the National Endowment of Democracy,
Exactly.
CIA, and
Our
other.
favorite CIA
Yes,
front.
yes, indeed, trying to destabilize the economy. But there's still Brazil and particular Argentina and even Ecuador. They could make all sorts of trade pacts to these countries and probably do well. And let's not forget, Greece is not without resources. I mean, their tourism economy is huge. I mean, because let's face it. That's the other thing. Speaking of the tourism economy, that was one of the proposals by the Troika, the neoliberals in the European Union, is that they basically sell off the
Right.
Greek ruins of the Acropolis and other sites that brings in, lots of money every year and stuff. So Greece has all these historical ruins that tourists come from all over the world to go to, not to mention the islands, not to mention they have a huge shipping industry and also a fair amount of agricultural exports, surprisingly, as well as chemical and some petrol exports. So they are not without means to support themselves. That probably alone wouldn't do it, but that in conjunction with trade agreements with other countries outside the neoliberal economic sphere would probably would work.
This Plan B, too, raises an interesting involvement with the U.S., Europe, and Russia. The idea that there should be some Russian involvement in the Greek economy occurs as the U.S. is embarked on an absolutely murderous campaign to destroy the Russian economy and indeed force regime change in Moscow via a proxy war in Ukraine. And if that's what they're thinking in Washington, and it obviously is what they're thinking in Washington, the idea that Russia would somehow be a savior for Greece from the Troika is not something that's going to go down well in Washington at all. Washington's upset enough with the Europeans because they think that France and Germany have undercut America's attempt to promote war in Ukraine by arranging a ceasefire. So I'm reminded often of the old SDS motto, everything is connected. It certainly seems to be the case here.
Well, why is it that we only hear about Germany and Greece? What about the other Euro countries?
Yes.
What about France? I mean, besides the ones that you mentioned before, like Spain and Ireland, that are vulnerable. Why don't we hear more about France or whoever else it is that might be a mediating or moderating force in this series of events? It just and perhaps that's my lack of understanding of how the euro works or how the European Union works or the European Central Bank works. You're right in saying this isn't about just Germany. This is about neoliberalism, but it seems to be so identified with German bankers. Is that more broadly understood in Europe?
I think it is, but I also think that the German bankers have allies particularly amongst the Scandinavian countries, whose economic position is close to that of Berlin.
But they're not in the Euro. Those countries
Finland,
are not in the Euro.
Finland is.
Just Finland. Okay. Yeah.
I admit, how many Finns do we need in order to to counterbalance the Germans?
Yeah.
That question has come up a couple of times in the last century or so.
Yeah. Right. The Greek people themselves. I mean, it has something to do with their willingness or ability to stand in solidarity and to endure the kind of suffering that they endured during World War II when they were occupied by Nazi Germany, after World War II when the Allied forces declared war on the resistance movement coming to power in Greece in a very bloody civil war, and then in the coup and the junta that governed the country from about 67 to 74 or so. So it's a very political and politicized country, and that may enter into and a small country in that intensified sense that may make it a relatively unique historical phenomenon for this sort of resistance to happen.
And as you suggest, it's been the victim of American, particularly, but also other European, straight-out imposition of fascism since the Second World War. So I think I don't know if it's being too optimistic, but I think the Syriza people have a sense of what they're dealing with, and I think they think, and they're probably right, that the story isn't over, that the sort of collapse of Syriza that we've been reading about it, particularly in the English language press, may be overstated. I hope so.
Let's hope so. Yes.
Right. You're watching news from Neptune. We'll turn to another story. David, what's top of your list today?
Well, I'm going to mention a couple of things in passing. I know there's been a lot of news out of Chicago this week,
yes.
and there's a couple of journalists that I think are insightful about what's going on in Chicago. One is a woman named Carrie Liderson, who's written a book called Mayor 1%, and who was interviewed on the Real News network a couple of times in the last couple of days about both the mayor and another issue also. And then there's also a guy named Mick Dumke, who follows the Chicago politics in the Chicago Reader. And one thing Carrie Liderson said was that, in passing, was that Governor, well, maybe it wasn't her said that. It was I'm getting confused with the interview that Doug Henwood did with a labor leader whose name I don't recall right now, but that Bruce Rauner is trying to turn this state into Greece with bad weather.
More recent ruins.
The economic benefits of bad economic benefits of Greece without the climate that Greece has. In response, I have to mention, just because I got to say this, is that the News Gazette editorialized this morning, Friday today, about the mayoral runoff in Chicago, which pits a Latino, an upcoming Latino politician against Mayor Rahm Emanuel, and the klutzy, to say the least, mentality of the News Gazette editors used the term knife fight in the context of this editorial.
Typical.
I'm not always one to do gotchas and to accuse people of being racist, consciously or subconsciously, but for a Latino candidate to come up, someone who seems like a very solid candidate to oppose Rahm Emanuel, and in this situation to refer to this upcoming election in 6 weeks as a knife fight. There will be no consequences for them saying that, but there ought to be. But we have seen what seemed to be even a few days before. I listened to a program from Chicago called This Is Hell, which has excellent interviews, including one with this Mick Dumke fellow. Last Saturday, I just listened to it on a podcast last night. The interview was before the election on this past Tuesday, and they were very dour. He was very dour about the possibility that Emanuel would be forced into a runoff, and he was proven to be wrong. So there's therefore a feeling, a feeling of cautious optimism about whether Chuy Garcia can really be a challenger. Another little sidelight of this that came out of watching Democracy Now! Was the interview that Amy Goodman did with a writer for In These Times. This Carrie Liderson also writes for In These Times, and there's another journalist, African American journalist named Salim Muwakil, who writes for In These Times. And Juan Gonzalez was kind of asking him, where does Congressman Luis Gutierrez stand in all this? And Salim, who's been well known for years in the progressive community, basically said, Gutierrez. He basically implied in so many words, Gutierrez supported Emanuel. He's basically been bought out by the Obama machine, and I'm not quite sure whether Juan Gonzalez was quite down with the fact that I think he was hinting at maybe something else, and Salim Muakil was quite firm in the idea that Luis Gutierrez is being exposed as rather a fraud in terms of his representation of liberal to left interests among the Latino community in Chicago. So a lot of interesting aspects to this.
Well, we have to assume that there's a lot of ignorance among Chicago politicians, including governors, mayors, and former representatives of the 13th district in the state Senate, over the fact that the Chicago police seem to have been running a torture center in Chicago,
Yeah,
a black site.
lots of news coming out of Chicago this week.
Exactly.
Yeah, that
but,
too.
But the remarkable thing is that Mayor 1%, apparently didn't know about that. Neither does
Supposedly.
yeah, right.
Well,
neither did President Obama. Of course, had been a state senator.
Yeah, well, I don't know why it is that The Guardian, which is a British newspaper,
Exactly.
right, and a journalist who is obviously, given his accent, American, named Spencer Ackerman, who was
Right.
interviewed on Amy Goodman this week, they're the ones. I mean, these stories, no matter how horrific and shocking they are, if the mainstream media doesn't cover them, they just go away.
Exactly. I think it's very important that it be a British paper that breaks this story. And of course, it's obvious that the mayor did know what was going on in this Holman estate, this black site that this torture center the Chicago cops were running. And I will be extremely surprised if an upcoming young legislator was not also aware of that.
You mean someone who you mean an upcoming legislator who became president?
Yes, that's the one.
That one.
Yeah,
Okay.
right, right.
Yeah.
I assume. I mean, the idea that this revelation comes about that the Chicago police are essentially taking hostages and torturing them. That this comes as a complete surprise from a foreign newspaper because nobody on the scene knew anything about it. That's nonsense. Of course they knew about it. It turns out that one of the worst of the torturers apparently went to Guantanamo to establish these Chicago procedures in the American torture camp in Cuba. We give the benefit of the doubt to our officials with far too much plum. It was clear what was going on in Chicago, and there wasn't any doubt on the people who were elected to do something about it.
Yeah, this black site, Holman Square, I think they call it. It's
Yeah.
on the corner of Holman and Fillmore. So I suggest anybody that's going up to Chicago, I'd recommend all sorts of people to start making vigils there and checking this place out. Holman and Fillmore. It's over on the west side. Not a very good neighborhood, but not that bad. So anyway, yes, I think it's I suppose the News Gazette, who characterized the upcoming runoff election coming in April as a quote unquote knife fight. I mean that even goes below the low standards I expect in the News Gazette. What I characterize it as, which is I think a lot more accurate, is people are just sick and tired in Chicago of being sick and tired of basically being sold out of the mayor 1% Rahm Emanuel doing all these special favors for his corporate buddies at the expense of public schools, of working people in general in Chicago. And what's interesting, Chuy Garcia, his name's real name is Jesus Garcia. Chuy is his nickname. He was part of the Harold Washington administration, the last decent mayor Chicago had during the 1980s. And he's currently the county commissioner. And what's interesting is Karen Lewis, the president of the Chicago Teachers Union, was originally going to run against Rahm Emanuel. And she was polling, when she announced her candidacy, she was already in the polls up in the 60 percentile range. And if she had ran, she probably would have outright beaten Rahm Emanuel. And there wouldn't have been a runoff election. But then she developed a brain tumor, unfortunately. And I guess this Chuy Garcia was recruited by Karen He basically had to gather 60,000 signatures in less than 30 days' time, was able to do it. But what's interesting, besides him going to be forcing a runoff with Emanuel in April, there's also 19 other aldermen who got elected that basically denied their opponents an absolute victory, and that therefore there's going to be a runoff there. And there was already 8 decent aldermen, only 8 on the Chicago City Council, and only one of those is going to have to face a runoff from a Chicago police officer. Just so you know that these candidates were given a lot of money. I mean, Rahm Emanuel's own personal campaign chest was over $12 million, and then he gave $1 million each to some of these other alderman candidates that faced challengers. So, you know, I think it's quite amazing. Another person that got elected that doesn't have to have a runoff because they beat outright over 50% of the incumbent they ran against was someone named Carlos Rosa. Very interesting Latino person, the first openly gay Chicago City alderman, and the guy is supportive of single-payer health care and to stop the privatization of schools, and as well as a $15 an hour minimum wage. So what's been happening in Chicago is real interesting. Despite Barack Obama doing television ads and even coming to Chicago and using the dedication of the Pullman labor site as an excuse, basically, so he can campaign for his buddy Rahm, it didn't do any good, not even in the African-American community. So, you know, people have caught on to Obama and his whole agenda, and especially his little pet pit bull, Rahm Emanuel. So let's cautiously optimistic hope that Mayor 1%'s days are numbered here.
This torture story may finally be help to galvanize some of the opposition to Emanuel too. I mean, whatever else you want to say about it, it's happened on his watch, right? And it's continued on his watch pretty clearly. And that raises further questions about torture and the Obama administration. One of the things we've heard frequently from Obama's supporters, who continue, of course, to occupy the Democratic Party, is that Obama brought an end to the torture regime that the Bush administration had put in place, and the horrible stories that we've heard about torture in Iraq and elsewhere was all last time, all the previous administration. This is absolute nonsense, and one of the lies which the Obama administration has dined out on from the beginning. Torture for all Obama's pious announcements about ending torture by executive order. In fact, it's continued not only at Gitmo, which we have heard about, but through the Joint Special Operations Command, this American military organization which reports to the President's National Security Council and is active in more than 130 countries around the world. Their activities are kidnapping, we call it rendition, murder, and torture. And that's what's going on around the world, as the rest of the world knows, but Americans don't. And it's gone on under the Obama administration. The Obama administration carefully excluded these activities from its public prohibition of torture when it began, because after all, there's a war on. It's the war on terror, right? There's a report just this week from the United Nations organization, which it called Credible and Reliable Accounts of Torture at U.S. Military Facilities in Afghanistan from the year 2013. That is not in the previous administration, but in the midst of the Obama administration. This is coming from the United Nations, of course. I mean, it's coming from sources outside the United States, where the fiction continues that the Obama administration brought an end to torture. It's not true. 2 reports this week, one from Chicago and Gitmo, the other from the United Nations, add to the reports we've had before that it's not so. You're listening to News from Neptune. The list of things, of lies and misreportings that we will have to deal with continues to grow. Let me turn to the question of of ISIS. What then is to be done, gentlemen?
I don't know if viewers remember last week, or I think maybe it was actually a couple weeks ago, when I posed the question towards the end of the program when we were talking about ISIS is, how is ISIS able to get the oil that they're selling on the international market out of Iraq? You know, I posed it as a sort of a question because I've been, you know, this whole thing with ISIS, there's just been little things here and there that I couldn't really pull together, couldn't really put a finger on. It just didn't, this whole story of ISIS and how they've been such a military success and just have been sweeping through Iraq in particular and, you know, good portion of Syria, have had such as this blitzkrieg success. And I mean, it was just kind of sort of troubling, but it's interesting as more facts start coming out. I found this here from Global Research story about, this comes from the Iraqi Parliament's National Security and Defense Committee. They shot down 2 British planes just last week that were carrying weapons, ammunition, and supplies to the ISIS fighters. I mean, people are saying, what? Well, you know, this is interesting because this just goes totally against the grain of the narrative we're being given in the corporate media in this country, is that ISIS is this new evil beyond evil, you know, the army of the Antichrist or whatever, that we have to, you know, give all sorts of carte blanche military authority now to Obama, you know, and the U.S. military to do whatever. But it's really interesting because the members of the Iraqi parliament are saying that this has been going on for a while, that actually these supposed airstrikes against ISIS aren't hitting ISIS targets directly. They're on the periphery. They're hitting other spots, and that this sort of airlift that's been going on to the ISIS, resupplying them with weapons and ammunition, has been happening going back to at least October of last year. In conjunction with the fact of how they're able to, you know, sell their oil. Well, obviously it's going through Turkey, and the Turkish government's allowing this to happen. Right. What's interesting is in the shot down British registered planes, they found both Israeli and U.S. made weapons. They are quoting one of the ministers here. I just want to kind of read here what he's saying. He added that the U.S. and international coalitions are not seriously in fighting against ISIS because they have the technological power to determine the presence of ISIS strongholds and destroy them in a month. He went on to say, this man's parliamentarian's name is Garari, added that the U.S. is trying to expand the time of the war against the ISIS to get guarantees from the Iraqi government to have U.S. bases in Mosul and Anbar provinces. And I would say that in the case of Syria, they're trying to basically do regime change against Assad and have some kind of one of the many Syrian rebel groups come into power, the ones, of course, that would be willing to more likely strike a deal with corporate interests and you know, U.S. military. So here again, I mean, this is what's happening. It's a game of diversion, of deception, and the real objective, you know, from what this is, this statement here, this news story, I mean, it all of a sudden starts making sense here.
Yeah, I guess in trying to just, when preparing for the program today, insofar as I prepare for it, it's just to do a lot of reading, but to come up with some perspective on ISIS, and the only thing I could really come up with to ask the question, who really opposes ISIS? I mean, who really opposes ISIS? In whose interest is it to really oppose ISIS? Is it in Turkey's interest to oppose ISIS? That's not clear that would be true. Is it in Israel's interest to oppose ISIS? I don't think so. Not really. There's a lot going on, but in a certain way, Israel's got to be happy with what's going on with ISIS, because it adds, anything that adds to this fear of terror and this constant rhetoric about terror is something Israel and its leader coming to this country wants to have. Now, who is opposed to ISIS? It seems Iran is opposed to ISIS, Iraq is opposed to ISIS, Syria is opposed, but the question remains, is the United States opposed to ISIS? Is it really opposed to ISIS in the sense, violently or non-violently, would it like to see ISIS go away? And I think that what that one leads to thinking about Iran and our relationship with Iran, and of course Israel's relationship with Iran and what that means in relationship to ISIS, whether there really is a shift going on in our government's strategy with the Middle East towards Iran and away. And of course, it has to be added that all of the Gulf states, it's hard to believe that the Gulf states do not support ISIS. I mean, they basically do support ISIS. So the question is, what is the United States strategy going to be if it wants to deal with ISIS? The only way to deal with it is to rearrange its relationships with countries in that region towards Iran, which is why it seems like the stakes of this deal coming up with Iran are very real, are very high and very real.
Why isn't the obvious solution, so to speak, for the U.S. to follow international law in regard to a threat to peace, as the UN Charter says, that since the Second World War, since the foundation of the United Nations, what's supposed to happen when a threat to peace emerges, and I think it's fair to say that ISIS, whoever sponsors them, counts as a threat to peace, what's supposed to happen is the UN Security Council determines what is to be done and directs the response of the nations of the world together. We haven't heard that. We haven't heard the American administration say we're going to raise this in the Security Council. In fact, they've studiously avoided doing that. Instead, what we've got from President Obama is a request for a new AUMF, authorization for the use of military force. It's the modern American phrase for a declaration of war. Obama's asked for a new declaration. We don't want to say declaration of war because that sounds too belligerent. What you want is just an effective declaration of war, one that gives the administration the legal right under American law, it's thought, to carry on the war that it's carrying on right now. The U.S. is bombing Iraq and Syria right now in pursuit of its usual foreign policy goals in the region, and that's worth a moment's reflection at least. But the way in which the government is approaching the matter, the U.S. government is approaching the matter, is to ask for a new declaration of war for a war that's already carrying on. Why is the U.S. unwilling to follow international law and raise it at the Security Council? We've heard from good American liberals that, of course, that's out of the question. Why?
Good point. And this is more of an open-ended war as opposed to one declared against a specific country, it appears. Is that correct?
Well, it's an open-ended war in the sense that it's the continuation of American policy in the region, regardless. What the U.S. has done for more than a generation in order to control Middle East energy resources, and it's important, I think, to understand that it's control and not just access to those resources. That becomes clearer now with fracking and whatnot and the change in world oil supplies. But, people used to say, well, of course, it's not the case the U.S. really wants the oil. We really have enough for ourselves. That was true. But the difference is that the U.S. wants to be able to control where the oil goes. If the U.S. has control over world oil flows, it has an unparalleled advantage over its economic rivals, whether it's Germany or China. To control world energy is at the heart of American strategy in the world at large. And to do that, what the U.S. has done is simply promoted war in the Middle East for more than a generation. If the American military is there, we have control of where the oil goes. And the quite appropriate question you raised, David, about how's ISIS getting its oil out, falls directly into the question of American policy, which is always about where the oil is going and the control of its various routes. The U.S. has done this by saying that a military control of the region is absolutely necessary. After all, we have to fight terrorism. I mean, we could wonder over in practically any time in the last generation what would happen if peace broke out in the Middle East. Would the U.S. say, oh, okay, we'll have to go home now, will bring the American military home? Probably not, because the real interest of the American the real interest of the American government in the region and having its military there is not to fight terrorism, but rather to control the economy.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, I'll just get back to my sort of simplistic view: is what does it mean to oppose ISIS? Does the U.S. really oppose ISIS, or, when you really look at it, isn't ISIS the gift that keeps on giving?
I think that's exactly right. Just as military troubles in the region, are in general that.
So, and I guess in the larger context, again, it seems like the real stakes have to do with maybe with Russia. If there's a way to connect all this to what's going on in the Ukraine and Russia, it has to do with the general strategic emphasis. I mean, we're much more comfortable with Russia as the evil empire than with Iran as the evil empire. We would love to get Iran back to where they were one of our allies, like they were under the Shah.
Exactly.
And really the stakes in relationship to the Middle East as a whole, and then that in relation to Russia and China really seem to be a larger context with which to understand, what the great game is all about.
I think it's important to see the configuration, the general military configuration that the U.S. Invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq have produced. When the U.S. went into Iraq in 2003, there really wasn't a major split between Sunni and Shia in the Middle East. Not in Iraq, and indeed in the region as a whole, even though Iran was a Shia state, and the America's other principal client, Saudi Arabia, was the leading Sunni state. But what's happened is the U.S. has been able to produce a divide et impera, divide and conquer regime as the Roman Empire once did, and produce these two, as it were, competing alliances in the region. One alliance that we could call the Sunni alliance, with the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia at one hand, essentially conjoined with Israel and Turkey. Even though these various states may have troubles of their own, they at least make up a bulk of American clients. And on the other side, a bulk of American opponents based on the Shia alliances of Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, and Lebanon, and even some non-Shia elements, including perhaps Hamas. But within this set of competing alliances, the U.S. continues to play a game which, as you suggested, David, includes reincorporating Iran into the American overarching what was the Nixon phrase for it? An overarching framework of control. In any case, this has been American policy since the Nixon administration, and the argument right now has much to do with the fact that the U.S. is attempting to reconstitute the clientage that it's had before across that line, that division between the Sunni and Shia alliances. So that's why we get an argument out in Washington about whether congressmen shouldn't go to Congress to hear the Prime Minister of Israel give a speech. Is this the way to liberal advance, David, do you think, for congressmen to put their fingers in their ears and chant, "I can't hear you," when Netanyahu shows up?
Yeah, I just, I read this morning that, the proposition program by J Street, which is J Street is sort of claims to be a, pro-Israel, pro-peace, and what they've really been trying to do is sort of triangulate AIPAC and the genuine pro-Palestinian movement, or left, if you want to call it that. And then, again, I'm sort of left cold, as I've said before on the program. I'm left cold as trying to understand why it is that it should make any difference whether, for instance, to go back to Chicago, Congressperson Jan Schakowsky is apparently signed on to not going to this meeting. Well, she's been, an ardent supporter of Israel her her entire career in Congress, which
Yeah.
goes all the way back to when I was living up there in the late '80s and early '90s, and so.
And even you couldn't convince her to
Yeah.
change her mind, huh?
Yeah, and I've asked people about that. I said, well, can anyone reason with her? And no, she's really a Zionist. I mean, I don't like to always label people that way, but it's like she doesn't have any intent of actually being a force in genuine opposition to Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. So I don't see where her not attending this speech gets us. I mean, it can be analyzed in terms of the Democratic Party politics and electoral politics and perhaps her local issues with the people that she doesn't want to offend. But it doesn't seem like a fruitful a fruitful tactic in, again, approaching the strategy of what we do about Israel's occupation of Palestine. This whole business. I mean, I think it's going to be great political theater. I don't usually watch this stuff, but I plan on. I don't know if it'll probably happen while I'm at work, so I won't watch it live. But I'll probably watch it just to see how ludicrous this whole thing is. So I'm kind of glad it's happening.
I think you're absolutely right. Did you notice that the administration announced today with some fanfare, more than they would usually use for an announcement of this sort, that Susan Rice, the wretched national security advisor to the Obama administration, and Samantha Power, the even worse ambassador to the United Nations, will be headliners speaking at the AIPAC conference, which occurs just after the Netanyahu speech. I think it's important that the Obama administration said that, because what's at stake in this kerfuffle about Netanyahu is the U.S. Attempt to make sure that it has Israel on board with what the Obama administration is trying to do in the reconciliation of Iran. This is not about nuclear weapons in any way at all. It has nothing to do with nuclear weapons. It has very much to do about whether the U.S. can count on Iran in its process of controlling oil flows throughout the Middle East. That's what's at stake. And the problem that the Obama administration has is that Bibi Netanyahu has been reading his press clippings, where he was told, even by many Americans, that, of course, the government of Israel really runs the American government, and the tail wags the dog, and so forth. And Netanyahu went out to try to do that and found out it doesn't work. Found out it isn't true. But in order to scotch Netanyahu, which is exactly what the Obama administration wants to do, it has to make sure that it has the sort of effective control of its Israeli client that it has indeed had for 2 generations. And I think that's, what they're doing here. This is go watch the Godfather movies and so forth. The Godfather is in the business of rubbing out an uppity underling. That's what Bibi is, while he keeps the organization, and even the underlings, a branch of the organization, keeps them nice for the whole situation. Uri Avnery, who for years has been one of the most interesting commentators on Israeli politics, had a column this weekend on the ruler of Israel. And he denominated for the ruler of Israel not Bibi Netanyahu, but Sherman Adelson, the
Sheldon
Adelson, the casino king, who tried to make Mr. Romney president of the United States. Sheldon has some coins. Several billions of dollars that he's used to get influence in the American and in the American political scene, and the Israeli political scene as well. But Uri says that what's happening here is that these folks have. And the point is that Adelson is the patron of Bibi Netanyahu.
Absolutely.
And Avnery, who is nobody's fool, he knows where the bodies are buried, literally and figuratively here, says they've blown it. They've overplayed their hand. The Godfather is essentially cutting them out, and I think he's right.
David, did you want to say anything about get your 2 cents in on the
Well,
on
I mean,
on these
we've
these
talked
issues?
in the past, of course, about what is the real objective of the American foreign policy. When I say American foreign policy, the foreign policy interest of the 1%
Exactly.
corporate sector in the Middle East. Is it really to stop terrorism, or is it to control energy resources? Well, I think it's pretty clear it's to control energy resources. And how's the best way to do that? Create a situation of apparent
Exactly.
chaos,
Exactly.
instability, to where not only American liberals are screaming for U.S. intervention, but so are a lot of other people in the region. I mean, it seems perfectly logical that this is a pretty good play. And these tactics used by the current ruling class of the U.S. and Britain, they go back a long ways. I didn't realize they went back as far as the Roman Empire. I'm more familiar with what they did in Ireland as far as British rule, basically dividing the Irish along Catholic and Protestant lines.
Right.
And not to mention the creation of the State of Israel. I mean, how do you go from a terrorist group, a Zionist terrorist group in Palestine, shortly right after the Second World War in 1946, blowing up the King David Hotel, killing a lot of British citizens and officers, and then within a matter of a year or so, the government of Britain is supporting the creation of the State of Israel. I mean, of course, another, what was it, the quote, Carl, from Churchill, that we're going to create another little Ulster in the Middle East, referring to the British policy in Ireland. So it all makes sense. Create chaos, create boogeymen, and to where you have lots of people just begging for the U.S. to come in because, after all, the United Nations is no longer functional, and partly because the United States makes it so, or I should say the U.S. government makes it so.
The excellent, brilliant Brazilian pundit, Pepe Escobar, who writes really quite well about world politics from a base in Hong Kong, as often as not, uses as his standard phrase for the American government, the empire of chaos. That seems to me to be absolutely right, and Pepe is a good guide to how the empire of chaos is actually behaving.
Yeah, let me just. This isn't exactly a response to what either of you has just said, but let me just say that it's certainly in these times in which Netanyahu is coming, and there's much kerfuffle among the population at large, among the pro-Israel community, the pro-Palestine community, within the Jewish community. One would expect to find, even at this, perhaps at this local level, with all the ongoing drama over Stephen Saleta and so forth, one would expect to find that there would be seminars and symposia and panels and conferences on whether Jews in Israel, whether Christians in Israel, but of course one doesn't find any of that. One doesn't find a peep or a word of substantive conversation or dialogue, whereas one does, if one works on campus, one gets emails from Phyllis Wise trumpeting the fact that she is still all about diversity, and that there are going to be a series of speakers coming to campus speaking on topics of which I have almost no interest in hearing about, and will patiently wait for something in which people actually discuss the substantive issues behind all this.
The diversity of nonsense.
You've been watching news from Neptune for the 9th week of 2015, a Where Are the Snows of Yesteryear edition. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been David Green and David Johnson. Our thanks to our director and producer, Jason Liggett. Upcoming programs here on UPTV include Labor's Worldview, Sunday at 4 p.m. with David Johnson, and more news from outside the bubble, as Harry Shearer says, that you can't hear elsewhere in CU. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune. Remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.